What was the real reason why Steve Carell left the series so abruptly? Which passionate kiss was a totally unexpected improv? How did The Office save money on actors? And why was Dwight's potential spinoff brutally canceled? Hi, I'm Dylan. Let's dive in. Unpredictable Dwight. This man has the outstanding ability to simultaneously be the freakiest and still somehow most endearing character. So it comes as a big surprise that originally Rainn Wilson auditioned for another role, and not just any other role, but for Michael Scott. Truth be told, it wasn't just Rainn who tried to become the boss of Dunder Mifflin. Bob Odenkirk also tried his luck. And in a way, he kinda got a similar part in the final season. But back to Dwight, this personality hides tons of secrets. Like, can you believe that we almost got a Dwight spinoff? The show was supposed to be about Dwight's infamous beet farm that he runs together with his creepy cousin Mose. And actually, you probably even saw the pilot, you just didn't know it. Do you remember that episode in Season 9 where we saw a lot of Dwight's life at the farm? That was actually meant to be the pilot of a new series, but NBC passed on it for several reasons. First, they didn't want Rainn to leave The Office. Second, it wasn't really working. The mockumentary style felt odd there. The rest of the Schrute family were not that easy to relate to and were strongly inferior to The Office characters. And finally, in his own series, Dwight had to suddenly turn from the weirdo we knew to the main character who we were supposed to finally understand and sympathize with. It felt totally artificial and unbelievable. And one last funny thing about Dwight before we explore some spicy secrets of John Krasinski. You might remember Dwight's freaky cousin Mose, and even though he doesn't appear too often on the show, he's actually an important member of The Office crew. That's actually Mike Schur, the co-creator of The Office, and other popular shows like Parks and Recreation and The Good Place. Yeah, this guy. If that's hard to believe, you'd be totally stunned by the story of how John Krasinski totally screwed up his first impression. The hidden side of Jim Halpert. Turns out Krasinski's a huge fan of the original British version of The Office, but that didn't really help him get the role. Actually, it almost ruined his chances. When Krasinski was waiting for his audition, a man sat next to him and asked John what he thought about this upcoming American version of The Office. And recklessly, John answered that Americans usually screw up such things and then added, "I just don't know how I'll live with myself if they screw this show up and ruin it for me." Little did he know that the man he was talking to was the show's creator, Greg Daniels. So when John entered the audition room, this is what happened.
And I went into the room and everyone was laughing at me because I was such a moron. And everybody was like, "Is this the jackass that told you that the show's gonna be ruined? Go for it, kid."
Weirdly enough, that awkward situation warmed up the entire room and helped John to show his best side. That is a funny story, of course, but don't you secretly want to know whether Jim and Pam had more than an on-screen romance? Actually, there are some cute behind-the-scenes moments that make you believe there's more than just friendship between these two. For example, that heartwarming note that Jim put in Pam's teapot was actually a real handwritten letter from John Krasinski to Jenna Fischer. He wrote about what their time on The Office meant to him and how he appreciates their years together. And Jenna actually kept the wedding ring that Jim gave to Pam. More so, during one of her interviews, Jenna admitted that she and John were genuinely in love. So, is there something more between the two? Well, John's reaction to Fisher's words were pretty down to earth. "I think that it was taken wildly out of context and I feel bad for her," Krasinski revealed. No wonder really, as he had been married to actress Emily Blunt for more than a decade now, and Jen is happily married to screenwriter Lee Kirk. Another tiny, though entertaining, secret detail about Krasinski is that he is actually the author of the famous opening credits. The story goes that Krasinski and some friends took a trip to the town where Dunder Mifflin is located just for fun, not knowing that his footage would end up becoming the show's opening sequence for all 9 seasons. And what about the heart and soul of Dunder Mifflin, Michael Scott? Let's see what his secrets were behind the scenes. Steve Carell struggles on the set. To start with, Carell made his co-stars suffer, for real. And, contrary to his character, it wasn't because of inappropriate jokes. It was because of his overactive sweat glands. Turns out that the set was constantly kept at 64 degrees Fahrenheit just so Steve could be comfortable. Eventually, the show had to invest in space heaters for the rest of the cast to combat the unbearably cold temperatures. Who knows, maybe the frigid temperatures helped the actors set the "I hate you" look for Michael Scott when he got them with all those crazy pranks and requests. Especially in the first season, Speaking of, have you ever noticed how drastically Michael Scott changed from the character he was in Season 1 to the person he becomes in the following seasons? If you look back, you'd remember that Michael was really monstrous back then. Everybody hated him, and as a boss, he got nothing done. Everything about him, including his entire look, was mean and really unlikable. The reason behind this was to make Scott similar to his counterpart from the British version of The Office. Actually, the showrunners even hid some Easter eggs as a nod to the show's origins. That's why if you watch carefully enough, you will notice that Michael actually keeps a British flag on his desk during some scenes. Anyway, the idea to make Michael very similar to the UK character David Brent didn't really work as a long-term idea. The audience accepted Michael as nothing more but a cruel and stupid villain. That's why in Season 2 we discover a more human side to Michael, and his entire look becomes more likable. Plus, we see how lonely he really is, and we finally see that he's actually a pretty good seller. His relationship with Jan makes us see that Michael is far more vulnerable in comparison to her, and way more reasonable than we initially thought. By the way, the creators wanted to make Jan even crazier than she was. Do you remember the dinner party episode where Jim and Pam were invited to Jan and Michael's house? It was a bleak episode for many reasons, but mostly because it really showed how toxic Jan and Michael's relationship was. It's hard to think of this episode being any grimmer, but it almost was. In fact, in the first draft of the script, Jan hits the neighbor's dog and kills it on purpose. No comment on that. I'm just glad they excluded this idea eventually. Another funny side of Steve Carell is his love of improvisation, and sometimes his unpredictable moves really surprised his co-stars. That was exactly the case in the Season 3 episode, Gay Witch Hunt. No one expected that Steve and Oscar's iconically awkward kiss would actually happen. Even Steve Carell didn't know that until he was literally feeling it in the moment. That's why the reactions from the cast were completely genuine. One more secret is connected with sweet kisses. Perhaps you remember Michael's realtor and later a short-term girlfriend who was named Carol? The two are much closer than what was shown in the series, as this lady is none other than Steve's real-life wife, Nancy. Actually, a lot of members of the main cast were much more involved in the series backstage. For instance, the actress who played the lovely Phyllis Smith was actually a casting associate for the show. She was the one who read lines with the cast members during their auditions. She was so hilarious that the producers created a role specifically for her. And The Office's bubbly chatterbox Kelly Kapoor did a great amount of work behind the scenes as well. The actress, producer, and writer Mindy Kaling wrote some of the show's best episodes: Hot Girl, The Dundies, and the iconic episode The Injury, where Michael infamously burned his foot on a George Foreman grill, are just a couple examples of her work. And as you might remember, all of these episodes are absolutely hilarious. And Kelly's sweetheart Ryan, portrayed by BJ Novak, is created with writing 15 episodes of the show. What a dream team! So, why on earth did the main star leave after Season 7? Well, the official explanation to that is simple. Carell left after the 7th season because his contract expired. But why didn't NBC make an effort to keep the lead character of a very popular series? One side claims that it was Steve Carell's intention, which he publicly announced in one infamous interview. But if we dig deeper, it seems that Steve was actually hoping to return in Season 8. According to interviews in Andy Green's latest book about The Office, Carell's decision to leave the show had more to do with network ambivalence than a burning desire to leave the sitcom. Another thing is that negotiations for Carell's contract extension came just as NBC was going through a regime change, and the new head, Bob Greenblatt, was not as big of a fan of The Office as we wish he would have been. So there's a possibility that Greenblatt just didn't bother to dive into the problem and hence didn't ask Carell to stay on for longer. It's really sad though, as lots of fans might agree with me when I say that the last seasons lost their magic without Michael Scott. What a pleasant surprise it was to see Steve once again in the episode finale. By the way, it wasn't only a surprise for the viewers. The showrunners wanted Steve Carell's return to remain a secret till the very end, so they didn't even tell the cast. At the table reading, Steve Carell's lines were given to Creed. So you can imagine how surprised everyone was to see Steve once again. And what are the chances that we will see the Office team one more time? In fact, pretty much every actor from The Office except Steve Carell has said they would be down to return to the show for a revival, even though it doesn't sound like a very realistic option. Here's some positive news for you. Jenna Fisher and Angela Kinsey have launched their own Office podcast, and it's wonderful. So if you're feeling nostalgic about the show, You know what to do now. What is your favorite episode of The Office? Share with us in the comments. And as always, thanks for staying awesome.